doing well. Had a good week, hopefully. It's been hot, but that's all right. That's what July in Tennessee is supposed to be like, isn't it? It's supposed to be hot. But, any announcements we need to make? Jay will be making the announcements in a few minutes. I don't know really anything. Do keep Charles in your prayers. And Shirley Ray Downs is having some tests run, or had it run Friday. I haven't checked on him because it's going to be a few days before he hears the results. But remember him in your prayers. Anybody else? And forget to mention that. He called me Thursday to talk. All right. Well, Nehemiah chapter 7 is where we are. Nehemiah chapter 7. But we're glad you're here. We had a nice vacation. We had a good vacation. Suzanne and I were able to actually spend some time with each other. And, of course, we got to see the grandbaby. But, you take a country girl and you take her to the city, or Gatlinburg's not really the city, but there's a lot of traffic there. And if you've been to Pigeon Forge within the last, 5, 6, 7 years, they've got a new thing that's on the Sevierville side of Pigeon Forge called the Island. It's got a bunch of shops in it. It's got Margaritaville. Eddie Buffett's got a big investment over there, and so all these other things that are there. And if you've gone there, you know that you got to park, and then you walk, and you go to all these little shops. And the parking lot's huge. And traffic was terrible. And we found a place. We parked in this parking lot, but it was full seemingly the whole time. Well, we went, walked around, looked at a few of the shops, grabbed a hamburger there, ate, and we're walking to our car. As we were walking to our car, this one car came behind me, and young guy, he said, "Hey, sir," he said, "Are you going to leave? Are you fixing to leave?" And yes. And I knew pretty much right where our car was. And so anyway, I said, yes. He said, "Well, can I follow you and get your parking place?" I said, "Sure." So here we are walking down, and my sweet wife decides, this is not where our car is. It's where our car is. No, it's not. So she goes over a couple of aisles, which I knew was vastly wrong, and she says, our car's over here. So I go find the car. It's pretty much where I thought it was. And then the guy is laughing the whole time because I have to go find her to bring her to the car. So, but we've done that. Susan's done that for a long time. Don't think that she's got Alzheimer's all set in, because when Ethan was still at home, we'd walk out of Walmart behind her just to see where she would go. And we'd let her go, and then we'd go to the car. So anyway, we had a good time, and we're grateful for the safety, and good to see you this morning. But Nehemiah chapter 7 is where we are. Nehemiah has basically now, according to verse 1 of the 7th chapter, he's finished. He's come back. He's rebuilt the walls, or led. Didn't rebuild them himself, but he led the rebuilding of the walls. And now he says in verse 1, he says, "When the wall was built, I hung the doors when the gatekeepers, the singers, the Levites had been appointed. I gave charge to Jerusalem, my brother Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God more than many." Now, why in the world they didn't make names, John, Dick, Susie, all those fun names, I don't know. But we basically just have some housekeeping things here. And we're not going to spend a lot of time with all of these names. I'm not going to show you my ignorance by trying to read all of these names. No. Yeah, the ignorance is already there. You already know that, but trying to read all these names. So I'll just tell you, go on Bible Gateway on the computer and read it to you. And but let's note some things here, kind of through this chapter quickly, and then we'll move on. But the wall's finished. It took 52 days, but the wall is finished. The gates are hung. And the gates are important. Now, remember, as we closed out the 6th chapter a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how that with the gates being not hung, even though the walls were completed, that you still had a city that could be taken over, could be penetrated. And that's true. And so the hanging of the fences, if you will, the gates, and there were several gates. These were the doors, if you will, to the walls. And there were several around the city, depending upon which time and how many. Some say that there was as many as 12 around Jerusalem. If not in Nehemiah's time, especially because you get really Nehemiah's time, remember, is really chronologically, even though I know the book itself is not there, but chronologically, Nehemiah's time is the end of the Old Testament time. And so you have, by the time Jesus is walking around Jerusalem, you especially have 12 gates, which would be about 400 years later, a little over 400, 500 almost in total. But here we have the gates are hung, everything is going well. But now notice what it says. The gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites have been appointed. So now they're getting everything in order. We've rebuilt the city. Now we can call it a city. Now we can build the city. Because if you stop and think about what had happened, let's just kind of get our minds in the same area from a historical standpoint. Babylon in 606 came and destroyed basically the city. They took it over. They ran it over, just tore up the walls and took everybody out for the most part. So 150 years later, you all of a sudden you have, or 100 years later, you have Zerubbabel that is able to lead back some 50,000 people, and he basically just leads them back to Jerusalem, and they just kind of come back. And we see that in the first part of the book of Ezra. And they're there, but then in the last part of the book of Ezra, you see Ezra leading more. Ezra is able to lead some more people back from Babylonian captivity, lead them back to Jerusalem. But Ezra's intent was to restore the religion. Although it would seem as if he had not been just tremendously successful, because when Nehemiah comes, and Nehemiah is about 12, 15 years later from Ezra, when Nehemiah comes, he has to rebuild the walls, and then once they get the walls rebuilt, like I say, it took 52 days, he all of a sudden begins to set in order. So they need gatekeepers. They need folks to guard the gates. It is said from a historical standpoint that they had folks that guarded the gate and folks that guarded the areas where their homes were. So you sort of had neighborhood watch, if you will, at that time. Folks that would stand on the walls and guard from the outside. And so you had gatekeepers, you had singers, you had those that were the official, for lack of a better term, the official worshipers of leading the worship in among the Israelites that were there in Jerusalem. And then you had the Levites, the priests, of course, that were appointed, that served as the worship leaders, the true worship leaders. And notice that in verse 2, Nehemiah says, I gave charge of Jerusalem to my brother Hananiah and Hananiah, the leader of the citadel, for he was a faithful man and feared God. So he gave charge. He gave evidently charge of Jerusalem, responsibility. Some speculate, and it doesn't say. What do you mean by gave charge? Probably, if you look within the context, that he's probably talking about that he gave them charge of security. They were in charge of the security of Jerusalem, because notice that he says, with regards to Hananiah, the leader of the citadel. The citadel was the fortress area of the temple, or what became known as that area, especially in Jesus' day. And so these Hananiah and Hananiah were probably the captains of the guards of the wall. And notice, though, what he says with regards to them. He says, with regards to Hananiah, he says, he was a faithful man and feared God more than many. Who do we put in charge? Who do we put in charge of the walls? Now that the walls are rebuilt, you got to have good security. And that security has to be given to good men, faithful men, God-fearing men. Why would that be important? If your guards are not morally sound, what's going to happen? Paid off? Not do their job? Lazy? City will be overrun again, right? So you want to find good men. You want to find faithful men, God-fearing men, he said. So he didn't just choose anybody. He chose someone that he could count on. Chose his brother. It's my brother. Now, is this brother from a standpoint of physical brother? Is it brother from the standpoint of nationalistic? That's up for debate among many. And I'm not sure that I'm qualified to just 100% say which way it is. But he chose two folks that he felt like could handle the job. And so he gave them that responsibility. And I said to them, verse 3, do not let the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. Here's a good question for you. When's that? Depends on what time of year, right? It's at its peak in the winter months. When? Lunchtime, a little after. Now, it seems to be when you wake up. It's July. It's Tennessee. Of course, it's not Tennessee there. So some have said that this could have been as late as noon. Some have said 10 o'clock in the morning. It's just, the idea here is that sun's going to be up. Light is going to be very, very helpful. So the gates aren't going to be closed or are not going to be opened when anybody could come in the midst of darkness. Keep them closed. Let the sun be hot. And while they stand guard, let them shut and bar the doors and appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, one at his watch station and another in front of his own house. And that's what we was talking about. They appointed guards. Some were at the doors, and some were neighborhood watch. They were pretty much at their house, up on the walls, their homes. Those would be good guards, right? Why? You're going to keep your home safe, right? Might not care about anybody else's house, but you're going to keep your area safe. So if you keep your area safe, then guess what? You do that all the way down the line, everybody is going to be safer. So it's good, an interesting strategy, to say the least, that Nehemiah has. Let's go on. The city was large and spacious, but people in it were few, and the houses were not rebuilt. Kind of sad, isn't it? And you see this in the prophets. You see the prophets writing about those that, or some that were in sealed houses, or what we would consider finished houses, and those that weren't. But they'd come back to Jerusalem, and they'd been there for years, and they really didn't have the initiative to fix up. Who knows why? I don't know. Could it have been that they knew that anybody could come in because they didn't have walls and they didn't have gates that you could close, and so therefore anybody come in and destroy it again? Could be. Could it have been that they didn't have the supplies? Because remember, A lot of the supplies that were used in rebuilding the walls were the rubble that was there. Could have been. Could it have been that they just were lazy? Could have been. Well, I don't know the answer. And I don't know that there is an answer that can be given. It just says that the houses were not being rebuilt, and so they were laying in ruins, and there weren't a lot of people there. But it was time to rebuild, at least Nehemiah thought. And so verse 5 says, my God put into my heart to gather the nobles, the rulers, and the people, that they might be registered by genealogy. And I found a register of the genealogy of those who would come up in the first return, that would be Zerubbabel's return, and found written in it, these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity, of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone to his city. Nehemiah decides we need a population count. We need a census. We need to count the people. And that was part of finding out who's there. Who's there? And so Nehemiah sets about doing that. When you stop and think about God's people have always been the bridge to the hope for the future that lies ahead. God needs his people to do what they will do and to be the ones that are the workers for what he sets out to accomplish. Jerusalem has to be restored. You know why? How much of the New Testament could have been fulfilled, or the Old Testament fulfilled in the New Testament, if Jerusalem had simply laid in ruins? Not much, right? So you had to have Jerusalem restored. It gets back to, in Galatians, the book of Galatians, Paul said basically that when it was the right time, when in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. And the thought there, if you're studying the book of Galatians, is that it's saying basically at the right time. Just at the right time, God sent his Son. And then most folks attribute that to what's called the Pax Romana, which was signed about 4 BC. It just simply means Pax is Latin for the peace of Rome. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And that Rome was peaceful and that it was the right time. Well, it was. You could say politically it was the right time, and you could say it was the most needful time spiritually. You could say many things about being the right time, and that's right. But you still go back, if you think about it, that you still had to have this rebuilding of Jerusalem in order for the Lord's work to be finished. And so the Lord, of course, works, and he works in us, and he works through us. Notice, though, verse 5, that basically Nehemiah says, God put it in my heart. I was inspired by God. I was inspired by God to do this. And therein lies a discussion, I guess, for lack of a better term. For us, it's very difficult. And that is, does God put something in our heart today? And if he does, how and when, and how do we know it? And that is a huge, huge discussion. More time than we've got. I think our faith would say, yeah, God does work in us and through us. And we do know that God works on us through his word. Does God whisper within our hearts in the still of the night? I don't think so. There's much about God's working in and on us that, I'll be honest, I don't understand, and I don't think, and I don't feel. I've tried to read a whole lot on this because of my lack of understanding and ability to express it. I don't think anybody else does because I don't think God revealed it. But I think by faith that I can trust God, that God will get what needs to be done. One of the, as Suzanne and I think I've shared this with you before, but as Suzanne and I were looking at places to preach, and our discussion, a lot of times we would go try out at a place, and we'd talk about the pluses and minuses on the way home. You know, is this somewhere we want to come? Is this not somewhere we want to come? But our big discussion then, if not that night, would always be then the rest of the week would be, how do we know if this is God's will or not for us and for our lives? And you do go out on faith, but you go out on the faith that God will somehow work it all out, and He does. I am thoroughly convinced. I said in a sermon a couple weeks ago, I'm thoroughly convinced God does. And I've seen it too much in others' lives. I've seen it too much in my life. God takes care of all of us. And the workings of it is not what we need to be concerned with. Just do our part, and God will get it all worked out. It's sort of like, to me, it's sort of like the workings of anything. Whether it's a motor in a car, an air conditioner, heat, a clock, whatever. I may not understand how all that goes together, how you do all that, how it all works. But when I buy a clock, I want it to work, right? And when I buy a car, I want the engine to run. Now, there is somebody that's got it all figured out and knows how to fix those things. And most things today, you know how we fix most things today? Throw them away. Matter of fact, when they were changing TVs, you remember the old big tube TVs that you had, and they were going to these slimline. I was talking to a guy. He's one of the deacons where we were at the time, that his family sold them, and his family worked on them. And I said, as they were going to these slimlines, I said, well, what's the life expectancy of one of these TVs? And he says, no more than 10 years. And I said, really? He said, yeah, no more than 10 years. And I said, well, then y'all fix them. He says, no, you throw them out. He says, that's the way they were built. He said, you throw them out and you get you a new one. I said, well, thanks. And that's just the way we've gotten. And so, but God works it all out. And God did here, didn't He? And so there's a need then to repopulate the city. Something somebody would like to say before we get into this next little group we're fixing to jump. Through His Word. I definitely think that that's the way God directs us. Anything else? All right. Well, let's look. Verse 7 begins this list of all of these people. And I'm not going to show you my ignorance by trying to pronounce all of these names. But just glance through them. These were the people that were there, according to Nehemiah. I will say this. If you go back and you see the same list, or much of the same list in the book of Ezra, you see a discrepancy between the two lists. And we could get into all this critical theory, well, not critical theory as you think today, but critical theory from the standpoint of biblical critical theory, that why are the two different? And really there's no explanation. It could be exact timing. It could be that some were not present. It could be that there was some gaps that just weren't filled in, but weren't known. And so we really don't know, but there is a difference in the two lists, but it's nothing that should concern our faith. It could just be an error with regards to who was counting, when were they counting, who came out to the counting, so to speak. But notice that there are about 10 different groups listed. Also, there's verse 39, there's the priests that are listed. Verse 43, there's the Levites that were listed. Verse 44, there's the singers that are listed. Now, I want you to just stop right there for just a second, just because there's something that I hope you catch. Verse 44, it says the singers. Now, who does it say the singers are the son of? The son of Asaph. Do you ever remember seeing that name in the Bible? Psalms. Usually under the subtitles, right? Or the subtitles. You'll see the chapter heading, like chapter 33. I don't know if that's a song. No, it's not. You'd have to get over to maybe, the 70s and the 80s, where you see the Psalm of Asaph. Now, remember, those subtitles, first of all, are not inspired. They were added years later. But they often, a lot of them, as Ken said, that's what they say, a Psalm of Asaph. Well, who was Asaph? Well, according to Nehemiah, he was a singer, a worship leader. There were those that were descendants of Asaph, and then there were the gatekeepers, and then verse 46 says that there was the Nethinims. Who were the Nethinims? Well, these were the folks that really helped the priests. They were, if you look, especially in Joshua's day, they were the gatherers of the wood and of the water for the assembly. And so it has listed there these folks helped. It lists verse 40 or 57, the sons of Solomon's servants. Why? I don't know, other than it does. Verse 60 gives us an idea. All of Nethinim and the sons of Solomon's servants were 392. So that's a small count of those that were Solomon's kinfolks. And you get on down through that list, you get down to verse 64. That's where I want now. Does anybody want to say anything about those names? All right. Well, let's look at verse 64 then. These sought their listing among those who were registered by genealogy, but it was not found. Therefore, they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled, and the governor said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things till a priest could consult with the Urim and the Thummim. There's three ideas there that I want us to look at. First of all, there were priests serving as priests that weren't what? They weren't qualified. Why were they not qualified? Where did they have to come from? Tribe of Levi. If you weren't a Levite, you couldn't serve. But then you also had to do what? You also had to prove your lineage. Today, when you're born, you get, or your parents get, what's called a what? Birth certificate. Now, birth certificate proves, well, maybe I don't know. There's evidently a story there that I probably don't need to know. I'm staying away from that one. Excuse me. But you get a birth certificate. That birth certificate tells you, name and place of birth and doctor, I believe, and parents and date, and may say some other things. It's been a while since I looked at mine or Ethan's, either one. And but you had to, as a Jew, you had to prove your lineage. Where'd you come from? And it's speculated that some of these were not qualified because they hadn't yet proved their lineage. And that's where most of them, they think the discrepancy is. I'm not sure. It's just that it just says that, notice what it says. It says that they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled, but yet they were going to find out about them, as we'll see here in just a few minutes. But also, he says that they're not to eat the most holy things, those things that were brought to the priest, till the priest could consult the Urim and the Thummim. You ever heard of the Urim and the Thummim? Well, good. I won't have to talk about that now. The Urim and the Thummim were said to be upon the ephod, right? And there's a lot of difference in the history of this and exactly how you consulted it. The one that I tend to rest my understanding upon is that the ephod, there were these stones, and these stones were of different colors. And what you would do is you would take them and you would put them in a sack when you needed to decide something. And you would shake the sack up, and you would then, by virtue of the question asked, when you dipped your hand into the sack, you pulled out that stone, and that stone gave you the answer. You could say, well, preacher, that's the magic 8-ball that we used to play with when we were kids. Yeah, but the belief was, according to the way I understand it, and I'm not saying I'm the final official on this, but the way I understand it is that it was the belief that by putting your hand in the pouch and pulling out the stone that corresponded to the answer, that God had directed the action. And so you prayed about it, you played this, I wouldn't call it a game, but you made this selection, and then, of course, it was said to be God directed, and that was the way that God answered for them what they needed answered. It's sort of like, here's what we do today, and I don't think it's fair to God or right, but we'll say, well, God, just give us a sign. Let the picture move, let the cat sneeze, let the dog bark or whatever, and that'll be my sign. Well, I like to say I don't think it's right or fair to God or right either, but yet that was what they were doing. That's the Urim and Thummim. This is what we're going to decide. And we're going to decide what we need to do with these people. Now, does somebody have a different understanding of the Urim and Thummim? Yeah. Yeah, could be. Yes. The history of Joseph Smith and the way he used is interesting. We do know that he was a huckster and a schemer. Right. That's right. That's exactly right. He put it all in the hat, and he stuck his hat up. And what happened with regards to that is that he would recite, and folks would write it down. And that's why if you go through and read a lot of it, you say, that sounds a lot like the Bible, a lot of it. Yeah. And not on my side of the family from the standpoint of my blood, but there was a lady in, like I say, that touched my family that was a Mormon. And so that's, yeah. But he was a crook. Anyway, anything else? Yeah. I was afraid you was going to ask that. No, go ahead. That was the thinking amongst scholars today, that there were folks in Jerusalem, but then there were folks scattered, and they gathered them back, sort of like when they did the census in Matthew 1 and Matthew 2 with regards to Jesus' birthday. Mary and Joseph had to go back. They were scattered abroad, and had to come back for this census. That's the thought, but I don't know that that's the answer. But that is the thought.
So the census was of the present day at that time.
At that time. Right. Yeah. The thought is that Nehemiah is trying to see who's there, but to repopulate the folks and to repopulate the city. Anything else? Well, verse 66 says, altogether the whole assembly was 42,360, besides their male and female servants, of whom there were 7,337. They had 245 men and women singers. Their horses were 736. Their mules, 245. Their camels, 455. Donkeys, 6,720. Now, I read that just to give you an idea that there's a lot of folks. And so we've got to figure out where they are. And that's why I answered Jim's question the way I answered it, because it's not just a few people living inside Jerusalem. So there's a lot of folks, a lot of goods, a lot of things that they own. And some of the heads of the Father's house gave to the work. The governor gave to the treasury 1,000 gold drachmas. This was about 19 pounds. 50 basins, 530 priestly garments. Some of the heads of the Father's houses gave to the treasury of the work 20,000 gold drachmas, about 275 pounds, 2,200 silver minas, and that which the rest of the people gave was 20,000 gold drachmas, 2,000 silver minas, and 67 priestly garments. So you had a collection, a giving, because a city needs not just what's there, but it needs folks to open up, right? If you're going to run the things that need to be run, then you've got to have money in order to do them. Now you can let them be, and it will end up being nothing. And so there's a gathering, but not just of money. Look at what's given. It says that there were priestly garments that were given, and so they understood who needed what, and they were willing to give. And so it says, verse 73 says, so the priests, Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the Nethinim, and all Israel dwelt in their cities. There's again the reason I answered the way I answered a while ago. And so then it says, the seventh month came, the children of Israel were in their cities. Anything else? Yes. Yes. Yes, not everybody's back, not everybody's there. And so you had people left, and admittedly, we're talking about 150 years from the original. And so you had folks that came in, you had folks that intermarried and things of that nature. And so they were trying to find the true Jew and the true people that were there, and they were trying to lock their lineage. Now that's something that's important. We have folks that study their genealogies. Good. I studied mine and found out most of them were in jail, so I didn't really study mine. I don't have a lot of stories about my ancestors. I've got 2 or 3 that go beyond my grandparents, like my great grandfather that came from Ireland, and he's the smart aleck that added the E to my name in Darty, Darety, and he wanted to be different, and so then we go back to the Dartys, Darty, and why he would add an E and still pronounce it Darty, I don't know. I know it's not the way it's spelled, but I can't help that. But when you, like I say, I do have some left. Matter of fact, when my aunt passed away, she had no heirs except for me and my sister. And she had a couple of lists, and I have them in safekeeping of my ancestry line where it goes back. And all that's valuable if you're going to study it, but not for any other reason other than just wanting to know. And that's fine. Those that study that and want to know their background, more power to you. But for a Jew, that was the ultimate. You knew your lineage. You knew where you came from, and you traced your lineage all the way back to Abraham. And so you knew so and so. And so sometimes we look at Luke's account, Luke 2, and Matthew's account, Matthew 1, and we say, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat, so-and-so begat. Why? Well, they knew that because that was their heritage, and they had to be able to claim who they were and where they went, where they came from. That's how they did it. And so it was important for them to keep this. And that's part of why this list is so important in Nehemiah. They needed to know who was there and ultimately ask, where'd they come from? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like I say, I often kid about. Oh, well, no, it's good to ask. And, folks like to know it. It's good. Anything else? What are some lessons that we can learn? Let's pick out a few strange lessons maybe out of this chapter. First of all, people are important to God. People are important to God. Think about these folks. Look at the list. You wouldn't know these people. We mentioned Asaph. We really wouldn't know them. And you might say, well, there's nothing mentioned about these folks. That's right. But they were still important enough to be counted by God. And so people are really important to God, which means what? Well, we're important to God. We're important to God. And not just important from the standpoint of important, but we're important enough that He knows who we are. Most people know us, if they know us at all, they know us by our what? Our Social Security number, right? Because that's who you have to give to everybody. And that's not a good thing. I never liked my driver's license in the state of Kentucky. You know why? Your license number in the state of Kentucky, at least when I lived there, was your Social Security number. I did not like to prove my ID in the state of Kentucky. But folks would say, well, leave your driver's license. No. So, but we are known really by a number, but not to God. We're known individually. There's the second lesson. How about venture? We need to venture out on faith. Think about those that left Babylon to come back to Jerusalem. And what were they coming back to? Faith causes us to act. We're studying Hebrews on Wednesday night, Hebrews 11. We're started Hebrews 11 this past Wednesday night. We'll study it again this coming Wednesday night, Lord willing. These folks acted on faith. We act upon faith and faith in God. And so we need to learn to venture out on faith. Faith sometimes for us, is not as strong as it should be. We just need to go and continue and follow our Lord by faith. Number 3, God keeps account of His servants. When I wrote this down, thinking about it, I thought about my past, and I thought about those couple of lists that my aunt kept of that side of the family. Now, my mother's side of the family, I don't know of anybody that has collected on my mother's side of the family. I'm sure there are, because of the name itself, Luckey, Luckey. But we need to think about people of the past, how important they were to us. And I was thinking this morning of folks that, if it weren't for them, because most notably my parents, but some other folks, Bible school teachers is who I was thinking about, that most of my Bible school teachers have passed away. And what's not passed away is they're years old, but I owe a great debt to them. And we should remember the people of the past. Keep an account of God's servants that have been important to us. Number 4, the Lord's able to keep his work going. How did God keep all this going? It's not so much how as just the fact that he did. What a great blessing that is. Here's one for you. New beginnings mean new opportunities. You might say, that's not in this chapter. Well, think about all these folks that came back. They'd been in Babylonian captivity. They had been Babylon's servants, and to a degree they still were, even though they got to come back to Jerusalem. But now they're getting to come back to their home country and do what they want to do. And so there's a great lesson there that sometimes new beginnings offer new opportunities of service, new opportunities of service to God. But here's the one I want us to, and we talked about it when we were there, verse 2. And that is that God uses reliable people. I heard tell one time of a preacher that was preaching a sermon. He used this for an illustration. He said that there's this lady that came to him one time and asked that her son be used every service, whether it was to lead a prayer or to wait on the table or something. And so he asked the lady, he said, well, okay, why? And she said, well, if you don't use him, he's not going to come to church. So he's coming to be used. Well, there's nothing wrong with being used, and we need men to wait on the table, lead prayer, make the announcements, lead singing, preach, teach, and women. But should those things at church make us faithful, or should we be faithful before we get there? And that was the point the preacher was trying to make, and that was the point. And then he, interestingly enough, he used that to go back to the priesthood. And who did God use? Not just folks from the tribe of Levi, but folks that were, as we saw in verse 2 and verse 3, feared God and faithful in their service. And so God uses those that are faithful. But we have to ask ourselves, what is faithfulness and how do we measure it? And that's a big question in and of itself, right? Anything else? Anybody? I really planned on getting through the first 6 verses of the 8th chapter, so it just shows you I'm long-winded. But anything anybody like to ask or say or bring up? Well, the 8th chapter is interesting. Ken, we talked about this Thursday night after a friend of ours gave a speech about the use of the pronouns. Nehemiah changes his pronoun. He goes from I to all of a sudden he doesn't use I in the 8th chapter. And you'll see it again in the 12th chapter. He'll use the personal pronoun I. But it's inclusive beginning in the 8th chapter. But he's going to get out the Bible, and the Bible's going to be read. And that's a great sermon in and of itself. But we'll talk about that next week. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our most kind and gracious and loving Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, for the blessing of it. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to study your word. Thank you for the great book of Nehemiah that reminds us that we're your servants in your service and that we're to follow your will and we're to follow you in every step of our life. We ask that you watch over us, bless us, and keep us as we go into the further exercise of this worship service, that we'll truly worship you in spirit and in truth. Be with us, watch over us, bless us, and keep us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.